African imperative, ethics and innovation in the fourth industrial revolution. There's something, before I move on, there's something very critical I wanted us to just get, more like a framework, right? So this paper is basically asking, saying that first, how can Africa catch up with this inflection point, which is the fourth industrial revolution era, right? But beyond just that, how can Africa also do this and still allow the fulfillment and prosperity of its citizens, of its people? And the attainment of ethical progress is quite sacrosanct because according to the World Happiness Report that was released 2024 in commemoration of the International Happiness Day, we noticed that the United States of America ranked 23rd on the happiness index, despite being ranked 3rd in the most innovative economy. China, that has had 4x growth, ranked 60th on the happiness index. So it shows that there can be innovation, there can be explosion in an economy in terms of finance, in terms of innovation, but yet you can have a certain sense of lack of fulfillment or happiness in the people therein. And so how can Africa leverage both worlds, prosper and still allow fulfillment of its people? But before I begin, so let's quickly do a run through about the different industrial revolution phases that we've had. So the first industrial revolution was between 1760 and 1840, which was mostly domiciled by the British. And there was the advent of the steam engines, the mechanized textile production. In summary, the core of the first industrial revolution was building machines that humans could use, right? And the case was to try and reduce the amount of human labor in that sense, right? And so this kind of caused the necessity to, of course, build factories and have machines that humans operated. Now, moving on to the second industrial revolution, of course, the global north, the part of the Western world also joined in that merge. In fact, this was part of the reason why we had the ability, or they had the ability to be able to build weapons of mass destruction used in the different world wars. Right? And so you had the advent of steel, electricity, mass production. In fact, eventually got its stand in the second industrial revolution. And then we had the third, which kind of birthed companies like NVIDIA, birthed companies like Amazon, because we had computers, we had semiconductors that came into play. Right? And this kind of changed things drastically. But more importantly is the fourth industrial revolution, which started in 2010 up till now. Now, of course, everybody keeps focusing on AI, but there's a lot that also happened in the fourth industrial revolution, which you have things like blockchain technology, you have renewable energy tech solutions, you have IoT, you have 3D printing, otherwise known as additive manufacturing. But what is more scary is that in all of these things I have mentioned, we cannot find so much African country that participated in these different transitions of the industrial revolution. And so the question is why? Why were we not at the table? Why were we not in the conversation? And so I want to invoke Maslow's law, as Roy Casagrande did. He did in his paper, and he mentioned that that every single post-colonial state, or most single post-colonial state that existed, right, had the challenge of actually advancing even after colonization. Right? And he said that the reason was because the three main components that every nation or every person needs to survive before thinking about innovation was not met. So you have the thing of food, shelter, clothing. And if you check across the African narrative, you check across the African discourse, you are always looking at these things: food, shelter, clothing, security. This is always the mainstay of our conversation. And this has prevented us from being able to move from just the point of food to even thinking about innovating different solutions like the global north have. Right? And so it's at the end of the day, if you summarize all of these things, it kind of falls to three structures: food deficiency, energy deficiency, and then lack of manufacturing infrastructure. And so what Roy Casagrande mentioned was that if at any point we are able to solve the problem of food deficiency, right? And he made the case. In fact, Professor Fadel Kaboub, the professor of economics at Tennessee University, said that there's a clear difference between food security and food sovereignty. And what he has noticed is that most times in Africa, the discourse is food security. In fact, they've labeled that for us as food security. Now, what is food security? Food security just basically says, how can I provide dietary nutrition for my people? Now, if that means importing the food, I do not mind, so long as I can solve that problem. But food sovereignty says, I have to provide food for my people, but beyond just that, I have to do it internally and source all of these things myself. That basically is food sovereignty. And it's quite interesting because in 1955, at the time when, of course, colonization started to die off and African nations were gaining independence, right? The global north, the Western world, the whole phase of 1950s to 1960s, right? And so in 1955, there was the Treaty of Rome. And part of the discourse in the Treaty of Rome was how the European world could gain food sovereignty. And so they heavily subsidized the production of food to reduce dependency on the colonies, because at the time they were getting so much staple crops from the colonies for themselves. And after having that conversation and then heavily financing food production, they were able to get to that point, right? And you had the United States part of it, you had what was formerly the Soviet part of it, which is why you can see that Ukraine is one of the largest exporter of wheat and other crops as such. Now, this kind of backed us such that we have to now start focusing on cash crops in the sense, so looking at coffee and the likes, because we do not have the resources to be able to play at the international market. And so food security became the narrative for us. In fact, in France, the Ministry of Agriculture is called the Ministry of Agriculture and Food Sovereignty, right? And so the core necessarily here is that we need to be able to solve the problem of food sovereignty. We have to be able to see how do we get food from ourselves. And as soon as we do that, because in local parlance, as a Nigerian, there is this saying that now who chop, now who fit think, now who chop, now who fit walk. Now the next is energy sovereignty. It will interest you to know that according to a report by Bloomberg, Zimbabwe has one of the richest amount of lithium. Now, if you look at the whole renewable energy discourse about wanting to do solar, so for those of us that have solar in our homes, one of the key components is batteries, right? And one of the most recent batteries that we are clamoring for here is a lithium battery, right? And so, of course, if you need a lithium battery, you need lithium to manufacture that. Now, Zimbabwe has a very large amount of that. But if you check the three biggest miners of the lithium in Zimbabwe, they are not Zimbabwean companies, they are Chinese companies. So you have Huawei Cobalt, you have Sinomi Resource Group, you have Tsingshan. These companies collectively have invested more than $2.5 billion into the economy of Zimbabwe. You have the Republic of Congo that is rich in cobalt. In fact, there's a war between BYD, a Chinese company, right, and Elon Musk's Tesla company, because both of them require batteries for their electric vehicles. Right? And so there's this whole case of who wants to get to domesticate the ability to extract these resources as much as possible. And cobalt is a critical component that they're looking out for. Again, look at the three largest miners of those reserves. It is Glencore. Glencore is a Swiss company. You have Seymour Group and Jinchuan that are based in Hong Kong. Again, not Congolese companies. And then you have our very dear Nigeria. The three, of course, biggest exporters are Shell, ExxonMobil, and Chevron. Right? Again, they are not Nigerian companies. And so, as of the last, which is the manufacturing infrastructure, what we've had over time is that, I was having a discussion with Dr. Jaffet, and one of the things that came up, right, was the case that the problem necessarily is not the fact that we are mining oil. The problem is that what we've decided to do is just extract and sell, no processing in between, right? And this becomes a very huge challenge because that ability of us imparting knowledge and creating processes for ourselves is where the real transformation entails. Not just extracting and just selling. And which is the same thing we're going to have with the agricultural industry, because when a lot of people say, let's go back to farming, you don't go to farm and then with your sickle and your hoe and expect to sell at the international market. You have to be able to have mechanized systems that can help boost up this agriculture at scale. That way you can catch up with the global discourse, right? And this essentially is what we're looking out for. But again, this is on the path of the colonial masters, right? These are some of the structures that they put in place. But what have we done also to ourselves to kind of hamper our own growth? Well, there are two forces that Rekasaganda also mentioned. He called it the innovative force and the preserving force. He said that the innovative force is a force that allows for disruption, allows you to challenge status quo, in the sense of it. And the preserving force is what keeps cultural norms and intellectual property in that sense. And so he mentioned that if we do not get to balance the innovative force and the preserving force, then there will be a problem. Now, I'll show you a good example of the problem. Our traditional banking industry, for the longest of times, have failed to capture the informal market, right? Because the structure was built on people having your books complete, you have to have your ledgers, you have to have all of your financials documented for you to get access to a loan, right? And so, because of the fact that we kept to that same structure, we kind of zoned out the informal market, and we could not have them have access to these different facilities, right? Again, also, if you look at the companies that get to provide our banking industries, the core software infrastructure are companies not to be served in any African nation. So you have Infosys, you have Terminals, you have Oracle. None of them are African companies. And in fact, what was quite sad was the fact that the software was not us, the server infrastructure was not us, right? But thanks to His Highness Lamido Sanusi, who at the time when he was the governor of CBN, kind of enacted the Nigerian IT banking industry policy, where they mandated that every single bank have a tier 3 data infrastructure in premise, right? What that basically meant is that you have to have your server that could allow you to run, so even if there's a failure one way or the other, your own server can still kind of support the system in that sense. And this is quite crucial, because think about it, the day any African nation becomes a national threat, it means that the Western world can just turn off the switch and then our economy will cripple. I mean, we are seeing the same thing happen with China, how much sanctions the United States is playing with China just because, quote unquote, they see them as a threat. And so the question then is, can Africa really make best use of the fourth industrial revolution? Yes, we've seen a good example with fintech. We've seen the incredible things that fintech have done. In fact, in the last 10 years, we've seen that, according to the PwC report, we've seen that we've had 40% mobile money access. We've recorded 1.1 trillion transaction volume thanks to these different individuals who have decided to not just think from a preserving level, but also at an innovative level. That how can we disrupt and how can we get this informal market present to us? And so you have the likes of Moneypoint, who are doing a fantastic job. You have the likes of Nala, Lupia, who also do incredible things. And so, in order to round up, I say this, that in Africa, we believe very much in collectivism, the philosophy of Ubuntu. I am because you are, right? And so in that sense, it means that even as we continue to kind of plot our growth in the fourth industrial revolution, we have to consider these different things and keep it at core. That during our equitable access, educational reforms, critical thinking, human flourishing, cultural norms and integration, we hold all of this as the core and then use that to promote the fourth industrial revolution. And finally, this is my own 2 cents, that these are the 4 policy reforms I believe can help Africa. Sovereign digital infrastructure requirements, which basically, in summary, just says that we have to have our own data infrastructure. In the breakout session as of yesterday, Dr. Desmond mentioned that for ChatGPT to run now, it was trained on data that was trained 20 years ago, right? Now, for that to have happened, it meant that there was already data infrastructure that was present 20 years ago that could allow them to harness this data, right? So it also means that for Africa, because right now, the report shows that we have 1% server infrastructure for AI. Right? And so it means if we want to play, we also have to be able to provide this for ourselves. Now, the next is local content technology, right? So we have to be able to promote the need for us to make our own, right? Provide incentives, provide access to different equipment, to these different startup founders, and also ensure that for every foreign company that comes to the country, to any African country, you have to transfer the technical know-how to our people. Don't just use them for operations. Don't just use them to do the things that do not require them to use their internet. Ask them to also teach them. And they have the Pan-African Innovation Procurement Tool and the strategic investments. And I want to end with this poem that I adapted from D.K. Chukwuemeka. Yes. My best favorite fantasy is the future of Africa. It was the dream of even my forefathers. We talked about convertible cars and skyscrapers, and eventually we dreamt of Wakanda. We came from an era that shunned our culture, that said advancement belonged to vultures, that if we wanted our cocoa to grow right, we would have to bleach them and paint them white. That if we wanted to survive, we needed to destroy our own delicate hives, replace the intricate hexagons with rigid squares, become pale, culturally bare. We entered an era that pushed back the other. We said we have nothing to do with that future. Preserve our tradition, resist evolution, maintain a status that was due for extinction. And yet, in both of these traits, we remained in one place, staring at each other, with no place to move, but to bump into each other so that there was no movement, only fruitless sentiment. Until we switched the train tracks, until we decided that there's no opposition between tradition and progression, until both eras crossed each other and produced the brainchild of advancement and identity. So our job met software and became calorie-wise. And language met AI and became Lingawa. And IO left boards and became an app, all for the heritage, but adapted for a different place. Thank you very much.